In the year 1692, between the months of February and May of 1693, hysteria grabbed hold of the royal colony of Massachusetts and almost did not let go. There were no barriers to the madness, no lines of civility. Once one was suspected, or a finger pointed, or an opinion was formulated about someone, they were, more or less, condemned. Innocent people, whose only crime was prospering better than their neighbor, or who lived a little different than most, were thrown upon a judicial system that went totally to hell. It is a cautionary tale we know as the Salem witch trials. Hello, I'm Donald Allen Kirch, and this is Stranger Than Fiction.
Forget the world you know. Enter a bizarre dimension where the strange and unusual guide your imagination towards the unimaginable. Life is stranger than fiction in these true stories, where the ordinary is replaced with the extraordinary. Explore strange legends, weird myths, and odd folklore. The facts are laid before you to examine. You're invited to draw your own conclusions on these true stories of the paranormal.
Like most of the horror stories in this world, the genesis of this storm started out rather innocent. Nothing more than a parlor game made by one adult so that some bored children could pass a cold winter's night. Tituba, a slave, shared native stories with colonial girls in the basement of the Salem village parsonage. Living in an age where females had as much freedom and rights as those born in some Middle Eastern nations today, their uneducated imaginations went wild with the stories the old woman shared. With the power of storytelling, the winter winds, fire, and eggs dripping through water, the slave told tales that would one day take away her life. Tituba was possibly the most sorrowful victim of the witch trials because, as a slave, she had no rights to consider. Like a horse or a piece of rope, she had been seen by the God-fearing of Salem as nothing more than property. Others were not so treated. The first afflicted were a 9-year-old named Betty Paris and her cousin Abigail Williams, who had just turned 11. Abigail was the daughter and niece, respectively, of Reverend Paris. Both girls, without warning, were said to go into almost epileptic-like fits of rage and torments, sometimes arranging their bodies upon the floor in obscene positions. They claimed to be victims of demons who were poking them with needles and screamed during odd hours of both night and day. Reverend Paris, concerned, approached the doctor of the village, William Griggs. Nothing could be found to help explain away the girls' afflictions. Medicines of the time were administered, and rest was prescribed. All was left to prayer and God. Later in the week, when both girls started shouting out at devils during church services, pointing at demons no one could see but them, the dark clouds of accusation crept up upon all. Witchcraft. Or, that is what history would lead you to believe. Investigations point elsewhere. Like today, those who do not have use the words justified, entitled, righteous, and God to their own ends. Were the Salem witch trials nothing more than a 17th century version of class warfare? Once a death, sickness, or unexplained affliction had been suffered by a member of a community, and that series of events was connected with the accusation of witchcraft, the accuser would have to enter a complaint against the alleged with the local magistrates. If the complaint were taken seriously, the accused was taken to a public place of examination where evidence would be made against the witch, their body checked for the devil's mark, and the accused was pressed for a confession. In the case of Salem in 1692, a complaint of witchcraft was considered well-founded. The prisoners were handed over to the authorities and set to appear in the superior court. However, in this case, the magistrates opted to wait for the arrival of a new charter and governor. Monies and family properties were suddenly brought to question. The next step was to summon the witnesses. Things were simple back then. A person could be examined and questioned, convicted with having created a covenant with the devil, and in some cases sentenced to death within the same course of a day. This proved true with the first recorded conviction of Bridget Bishop on June 2nd. She would be hung on June 10th, 1692. One particular death by the court deserves notice. The man was killed because he would not admit to his guilt. Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer, came to trial in late September. He owned a great deal of farmland, which would have been given to his accuser if guilt could be proven. Corey was a religious and stubborn fellow. He would not oblige. The court took actions. A unique form of punishment was administered, in which stones were piled upon his chest until a confession of guilt was obtained. Corey died without offering a plea, and his body was cast aside in a pauper's ditch. Some speculate that Corey refused to confess on the grounds that if he remained silent, those who were trying to steal his lands with false accusations would never be able to do so. Corey had pleaded not guilty when first arrested. When faced with the knowledge of the jury being made up of family members of his accused, he thought best to remain silent. What would any of us do if faced with that option of death or abolishment? Death itself was not the end of the victim's shame. Convicted witches, warlocks, and servants of the devil were instantly excommunicated from the church, and none were given a proper burial. As soon as they were cut down from the local hanging tree, their bodies were allowed to roll down a hill, landing within a shallow ditch, which was barely covered with dirt. Many times, one would be able to spot a hand or a foot poking out of the earth, a feast for the local wildlife. Even within the local Salem records, there was insult. None of those executed ever had their deaths recorded. It was as if they never existed. Most of the evidence, but certainly not all, was spectral in nature. That is to say, the accused could be found guilty if only his spirit or vision were seen in action. If a victim came forward and stated before the court that they saw the vision of John Smith, seek them out. John Smith could be arrested for the charge of witchcraft. Mr. Smith was considered guilty because an evil force used his likeness. In using his likeness, he must be in league with the devil. Theologically, priest and judge alike were at war on this subject, each trying to state their case. Judges were concerned about hearsay. Priests, most honest in their endeavors, held the importance of saving souls at stake. The priest went as far as to say that if the devil were to take on the spectral form of someone else, that person would have to give him permission to do so. Judges stated that the devil, if he were indeed so powerful, could take on anyone's identity. After great debate and several more hangings, it was deemed unwise to base whole cases on the validity of spectral evidence alone. Another and quite logical reasoning for this were twofold. One, most of the ones accusing others of spectral evidence were poor and owed debts to those being hanged. And two, one brave soul went as far as to state that she was approached by the spectral image of the wife of the royal governor herself. The whole affair was getting out of hand. Other forms of witch detection were used, including the baking of a witch's cake. A witch's cake was performed by creating an edible dish made of rye meal and urine from the afflicted victims. Of course, such a meal was never given or fed to a human, but instead a dog living on church property. Upon eating the cake, it was believed that as the cake was devoured and digested by the beast, the accused witch would cry out in pain. An ancient document stated these facts clearly, that the witch, upon beaming evil powers through her eyes at her intended victim, would be cursed to feel the pain of digestion from the particles of her own magic left behind in the urine of her victims. There are no results from these actions. Reverend Paris condemned the action, getting one person accused redeemed by stating to those who accused her that they went to the devil for help against the devil. In the end, a show of hands within the records of the township saved the woman from being hanged, and she became redeemed within the eyes of her fellows. Perhaps Reverend Paris knew the hidden motivations behind the accusations. When spectral evidence and other paranormal conundrums were thrown out of the court, most lawyers and accusers returned to the original story of Tituba and the winter of 1692. Tituba, who supposedly taught the girls involved the powers of voodoo, held no legal rights, and as stated, was seen as nothing more than a piece of property. Since property was at stake in these matters, it seemed only logical to have a piece of talking property have say in court. In any other trial, such an act would have been laughed out of the building. This, however, was God's work they were doing. Tituba had no choice. Although there are no records to the contrary, most speculated that Tituba was beaten and treated quite serious in her stay at prison. Wishing to end her torment, she started talking in the way she believed her masters had wished her to speak. She had only made matters worse. At trial, she stated, for the record, that there were creatures that inhabit the invisible world, and the dark rituals which bind them together in service of Satan. Upon further suggestions, she implicated several in her guilt, stating that many other people in the colony were engaged in the devil's conspiracy against the Bay. Those who were present at her hanging saw surprise and amazement within her facial lines. Could she have been lied to? Could she have been a fool used by others trying to acquire valuable land? Remember, once a person was found guilty of witchcraft, they forfeited all rights to ownership and citizenry. After the abolishment of spectral evidence came the touch test. This was in the idea that if a witch, by evil cast of their eye, sent forth a sickness into their victim, could by act of sympathy cause the very ailment to leave the body of the affirmed by the act of touch. The witches were blindfolded and sent into a dark room where the victim of witchcraft was said to be having a fit. Once the witch's hand touched the person in their rage, and that rage were to stop, guilt was proven. On the surface, this looked both logical and practical to a learned and religious man. But consider the one accused, who owned the land that the poor farmer, the victim, had always dreamed of owning, having a chance to fulfill that dream. What would you do? Would you throw a fit and then claim a cure at the touch if your dream were upon the threshold? When the touch test became a carnival, other forms of de facto evidence were introduced to the courts. Physical examinations of those accused became a popular form of entertainment. There were recorded cases of young women being stripped of their clothing and having every single inch of their body checked for what they called witches' teats. These were either moles or freckles upon the body that were sensitive or immune to pain. Inspectors would poke these questionable areas with needles. Some confessions later in their own lives had inspectors stating that they used dull needles on those so-called witches, claiming that there was no pain detected because Satan was blocking it at the time of the inquiry. Once the court started knocking upon the door of the royal governor, calling forth his own wife was ending this even considered. The last trial was held in May of 1693. The decades that followed the aftermath held family members against their neighbors, trying to reclaim land that had been rewarded to those doing their sworn duty to the community. This is not a story meant to rebuke the parties involved. Hindsight is an ironic thing. It allows us, in the present, to see the folly of other people's ways. In reading the documents, and there are many on this subject, it is quite possible that the Puritans involved honestly believed that they were fighting the devil. We in the modern age see their courts as a child proclaiming to all that there are monsters in the world, that evil is real. Well, one look at the local news would reinforce most of that claim. Mob justice, however motivated, is more evil and deadlier than 1,000 devils. The mob is mankind without a heart, without mind, and without order. That is the most logical way to explain the horror of the Salem witch trials. Innocent people were hanged on hearsay. If there is one shining legacy that came forth from all of the horror of this, after the Salem witch trials, it became an American frame of mind that all were innocent until proven guilty. Once the Founding Fathers started to reshape the American continent a century later, they made this ideal the law of the land. No more would a person be held in prison just on hearsay alone. As John Adams once said, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. No matter what the crime, each person within the United States of America is given their due course in court and hold on to their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor until that day factual evidence proves them guilty. All that from the aftermath of Salem. Perhaps the victims, if nothing else, would approve. We come to the end of another strange but true account of the paranormal. If you would like to see some of my personal works, please visit my website at donaldallenkirch.com. It would be an honor to entertain you. My books are available in both digital and print formats. Tune in at a later time when I will share yet another of my fascinating files. So, for Stranger Than Fiction, this is Donald Allen Kirch wishing you unpleasant dreams.
As to this thing, I am innocent as the child unborn. But surely what sin has God found in me unrepented of, that he would lay such an affliction on me in my old age?
Good night.